Hello there. So in this video, we're going to do a little extension on the current account, financial account thing that we learned about, and connect it actually a little bit to something that you learned about in Unit 8, which is the loanable funds market. And if you remember back to Unit 8, one of the shifters of the supply of loanable funds was capital flows. And that I was kind of alluding to the idea that if you have like one country with a really high real interest rate and another country with a really low one, money will flow from the country with the low interest rate to the one with the high interest rate. People who have their savings will want to capture that higher real rate of interest. And so the supply of both countries will change as money flows out from one to the other. And it's actually kind of an important part of understanding why the capital or why the current account has to balance the financial account. We'll actually get to see that in a later video. Before we can run, we've got to walk. Before we can walk, we got to crawl. So let's go ahead and model what that would look like. So this is kind of a review of Unit 8. So this starts with if foreign investors purchase US assets like stocks, bonds, or real estate, then those foreign investors are increasing the supply of loanable funds in the United States market, and they're decreasing the supply of loanable funds in their own market. So let's start with if the Europeans purchase US real estate, stocks, and bonds, and so forth. We're going to graph Europe and we're going to graph the United States. And we'll actually kind of start with these as QLF, right? So this is a good reminder of like how to draw the loanable funds market. QLF IR. And we're actually just going to start with them kind of being equilibrated, and we'll show that they kind of disequilibrate in this picture. And it's really could be just anything that maybe the Europeans decide they really like US real estate or US stocks or something, right? So what we're really doing here is just showing how there's like a double shift that occurs here. And so if this is occurring, the Europeans are purchasing US real estate, then that's going to cause the supply in Europe is going to decrease and the supply in the United States is going to increase. So S1, it's going to cause the interest rate to go down in the United States and the quantity to go up, whereas it'll cause a disequilibrium over here of the opposite way, where the real interest rate rises and the quantity decreases. So that's the idea of that capital flows and on the financial account. So we're actually modeling the financial account when we do that. And that's really all there is to it, right? You know, if we had more Europeans buying more American-made stocks, bonds, and real estate, then there's going to be a change in the loanable funds markets, right? And so this kind of is an add-on. It's like an addition that will sometimes show up on AP free response questions, because they'll kind of say, well, you know, X, Y, and Z happens, and then show how that connects to the other market, right? And they'll kind of add this in at the very end of them. So that's a piece to kind of wrap your mind around with some of these. Now, the picture that I've got right below is actually showing the equilibration, the opposite direction, which is perfectly valid as well, right? We know that over time, the picture below would actually happen because the investors would say to themselves, geez, you know, the European interest rates are so much higher than the American ones. I'm going to move my money back over. And so eventually these two rates would equilibrate between the two. So it kind of you could draw it like the way I did here on this side, or you can draw it basically as this way. Now the second part is going to be a little bit of some vocabulary. There are things that interfere with international trade, and then there's things that support it. And for like the very basic level of kind of AP Econ is knowing what those things are. And then we're going to show you some graphs, and that's where kind of I'm a little ambivalent about. So we'll talk about that in a second. So tariffs and quotas are things that are what we call trade barriers. These things restrict, right? Restrict trade. So they reduce international trade, and they have some effects. They make prices higher for consumers, but the goal of both of these is to protect domestic industries. And it typically can also affect the input costs for other industries. So for example, if the United States puts in a tariff, which is a tax on imports, right? So if you don't know what that is, it's a tax on imports. If we put a tax on imported steel, that would affect the US automobile industry, right? Because then it's more expensive to buy steel, and so it's more expensive to make cars. But it would help American steel manufacturers because they get a higher price for their product because they don't have to compete with cheap imported steel. There are plenty of examples of these in the United States. We have tariffs on sugarcane, on cars, on steel, a whole bunch of other things. At the same time, there are things that support more international trade, and these are called free trade agreements. And generally speaking, economists would lean toward more free trade because it creates more efficiency. It allows countries to focus on what they are comparatively good at, right? Think about comparative advantage in trade and specialize in what they're good at, and then import the other stuff. And so the idea here is we want to reduce prices for consumers and lower input costs for some industries, but certainly some domestic industries could be harmed. And there are some good examples of free trade agreements like NAFTA and the WTO. The European Union is a great example of a free trade agreement. The whole point of it was to facilitate international trade. So there's like some fun facts here that if you want to speed through, we could do that. Which U.S. sugar policy is really interesting. We have quotas, actually. A quota is obviously a limit rather than a tax, but we have quotas on imported sugar, and the goal is to protect U.S. beets. Little things that grow in the gardens, and you can make sugar out of beets. And it actually basically destroys American jobs in the manufacturing of chocolate and confectionaries, because it makes sugar a lot more expensive because we have this high quota. So it makes American, candy manufacturers at a significant disadvantage, and they try to avoid using sugar because it's so expensive. They use all kinds of other stuff. And it actually, in fact, is protecting a single U.S. beet sugar worker, a farmer, costs Americans more than $800,000 a year in higher prices for confectionery goods. So this is some real stuff here. Another set of fun facts is about NAFTA, the EU, the WTO, and there's all kinds of background about this. None of this stuff, like the specific stuff here, is going to be on a test or on an AP test, but the general idea of what a free trade agreement is might be, okay? Now, the next part is going to be two graphs. Now, I'm going to forewarn you and tell you that it's highly unlikely that you will see either of these two graphs on an AP test. And I will tell you that you will not see these two graphs on a Glossinger test. However, there have been AP tests in the past that have asked you to interpret these two graphs. You've never been asked to draw one in 25 years of this whole AP thing. So I'm just kind of forewarning you that this may seem a little sketchy and questionable, what I'm about to show you. But I want to show you how a tariff and how a quota look in case you see one on an AP test, right? So the first off is we're going to draw the tariff. And I don't want you to shade in anything below, but this is kind of what it would look like before a tariff is implemented. And so we'd have a demand curve that's a domestic demand curve for, let's call it sugar, right? And then you've got up here, this is the domestic supply curve for sugar. So that's like the amount that we can produce here in the United States. And then there's an imported world price of sugar. And this kind of world price, I'm just going to write here, world price, sorry. I'll let you zoom in just a little bit so you can see what I'm working on here. World price, let's say, is $3. And the intercept points here are, what did I say here, 5 and 35. And so what this tells us, right, is that the equilibrium price doesn't really matter, and the equilibrium quantity doesn't really matter. In fact, what this is telling us is that the first several units, right, up to 5 units of sugar, the domestic suppliers could supply those for less than the world price. But anything beyond that, the domestic suppliers, their cost of producing sugar is higher than 3. And so they're not going to be able to compete if the price is above, if it's 3, right? These suppliers from here to here are not going to be able to compete. So they're really upset and they're sad. But the American consumers are going to be able to import as much sugar as they want, and the world price that's kind of prevailing in the world is $3 for sugar. And so at that world price, the amount that consumers buy is 35, right? So we are importing initially, right? Initial import is 30 because we're going to buy 30 from overseas. I just wrote initial importing 30. But let's say, and by the way, what I've color coded down here is the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. And generally speaking, you won't have to answer questions about that on AP macro. AP micro might do it actually. And that's where it's a little bit, well, you got to know how to interpret this. So this big pink thing is the consumer surplus. So you can see consumers are really happy. The blue triangle is the producer surplus, the domestic producers. They're really sad because they don't get to sell very many units, and they see all these units getting imported. And so they negotiate and they say, government, put in a tariff. So the government comes along and says, we're going to put in a tariff in the amount of $2. So this is the world price plus a $2 tariff, right? So that's where this 5 is coming from. And so the amount of the tax is $2. So it shifts the world price up from 3 to 5. Now, there's a few more domestic suppliers who are going to be able to compete. And so under this regime, the new amount, what did I say here, 10, the new amount that's going to get produced by domestic producers is 10. And the amount now that consumers are going to import is over here. The total amount they purchase is 30. So the amount they import, import is 20. So it reduces the imports from 30 to 20. And you can see then that it kind of moves it a little fewer. This is changing the amount of surpluses and tax revenues. And this is the picture that kind of is an idea here to help you interpret this. So after the tariff is imposed, that's consumer surplus because it's above the price up to the demand curve. That's still consumer surplus because this is the price they're paying, right, is 5, and they're up to the demand curve. This box in the middle is tax revenue because they're importing 20 units, and so the tax is 2, so that box represents the amount of tariff tax that gets generated for the government. This amount is producer surplus, and now this amount is 2. So the producers are a little bit happier, right? They get this added little bit of surplus that gets captured from the consumers. Remember, the consumers used to have all of this stuff up here. But this thing here is deadweight loss, and this is deadweight loss. And so there is some inefficiency that results from this tariff. So that's what a tariff kind of looks like and how to interpret it. A quota is going to actually look pretty similar. So we'll kind of shift this over just a little bit here. Oops, let me kind of shift so you can see. Sorry, I'm kind of trying to do it close so that you can zoom in and see what I'm doing here. So we're going to do a very similar picture. In fact, I'm going to use the similar numbers so that you can kind of compare what goes on. Supply domestic, once again, and we'll use the same numbers as we did before. And we'll say there's this like world price of 3, and that corresponds to 5, and that's 35. And so again, at the outset, the initial amount of initial import is 30. Sorry, I'm having some trouble here with my document camera. So hopefully you can still see that. Oh, there we go. Woohoo! Oh my goodness. There. So this is the great big consumer surplus triangle, right? And that tiny little sad producer surplus triangle. And they negotiate with an import. And they say, we're going to set an import quota of 20 units. Now, I'm not going to show you the entire thing. It's a little bit scarier than we really want it to be. But what it actually, I'll go ahead and draw it for you because I know you're not going to be that scared. What it actually does is it creates kind of this second line that's like plus 20 that way. So that's like plus the quota. And so it kind of shifts that line over, and it makes it so that, so I didn't quite meet it there. It should be stopping much more closely. So this is why I shouldn't have drawn it for you. So it should stop like right there. And so the quota amount that's allowed to be imported is between 10 and 30. And basically this quota is just like a cap, and it says you can only bring in 20 units. So it creates this kind of second supply curve over here. Sometimes that's shown in, sometimes it's not. So I kind of fix that a little bit there. Plus 20, right? And that's really kind of like a supply curve of the domestic suppliers plus 20 units that are allowed to sneak in under the quota. But it ends up being basically the same result, that now we import 20 units. And now we only purchase 30 because the effective thing that happens is it creates a quota price. And this quota price is 5, right? It's just basically pushing it up to where it otherwise would have been. But the distinction here is that all of this now is deadweight loss. Because remember, we're not collecting a tax here. So this is just consumer surplus, producer surplus. And so quotas kind of don't usually get nearly as much love from economists. If you're going to do an intervention here, there's some benefits of quotas. You can very clearly say, like, this is how many are allowed to come in. But at the downside of it is that they're less efficient because the tax revenue is not considered an inefficiency whereas the deadweight loss is. And so there's more deadweight loss under the quota. I don't think that you're going to have to interpret either of these on this year's AP exam. You definitely won't have to graph them, but I did want to show you what they kind of look like, and thinking about that they cost us efficiency, and they lead to higher prices, right? Both of them do. They lead to higher prices. They help some of the producers, right? Some of these producers benefit, but they could also hurt other producers as well. So hopefully this didn't blow your mind too much. I'll see you next time.